This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order Lost Caverns of Ixalan, use my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Ixalan, and in this video I'm continuing with my Lost Caverns of Ixalan limited set review. So far we've looked at all the non-green cards in the set, and in this video we'll be looking at those green ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think it will play in limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. I'm only evaluating these for play in limited, and not other formats. This means we're only talking about cards in draft boosters. Also keep in mind these are my evaluations of these cards before getting to play with them, so I won't be right about everything. I will be providing updates about the format here on the channel as I play it more and more. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review you get a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the first green card in my Lost Caverns of Ixalan limited set review. First, there's Armored Kincaller, which costs 2 generic and a green for a 3/3 dinosaur. When it enters the battlefield, you may reveal a dinosaur card from your hand. If you do, or if you control another dinosaur, you gain 3 life. I really like designs like this that check more than one zone for a card with a specific quality. They did a lot of that in this set, both with caves and the craft mechanic, but here's a creature with an enter the battlefield ability that checks more than one zone. And the reason I like that is because it lets this sort of card do its extra thing way more often than it would otherwise allow it to. So whether or not you top deck this late and you already have a dinosaur in play, you're going to gain 3. If you play this on turn 3 and you have a dinosaur in your hand but not one in play, you're going to gain 3. Because it's that flexible and it has such decent stats, I think you're going to end up gaining 3 life with this a decent chunk of the time in green decks, and a 3-mana 3/3 that gains you 3 life when it enters is a pretty high quality common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Basking Capibara, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 Capybara at common. It's got Descend 4, and it gets +3/+0 as long as there are 4 more permanent cards in your graveyard. Capybara are one of my favorite animals. I'm glad they're finally making an appearance in Magic, although I'm a little surprised they got their own creature type and aren't just beasts. I don't know if that means we're going to be seeing more Capybara in the future. But anyway, this seems like a solid 2-drop. Obviously a 1/3 isn't where you want to be, but a 2-mana 4/3 is some serious business, and green is good enough at getting there on Descend that you can expect this to have a very relevant body by the mid-game. A 4/3 pretty much always means business. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Bedrock Tortoise, which for 3 generic and a green is a 0/6 turtle at rare. As long as it's your turn, creatures you control have hexproof. Each creature you control with toughness greater than its power assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So let's break this down. During your turn, it's effectively a 4-mana 6/6 with hexproof. During their turn, it's a 6/6 without hexproof, and then on top of all of that, it gives your other stuff hexproof on your turn and makes your other high toughness creatures better. This just seems like such a beating for only 4 mana. Giving it a B+. Next up, it's Cavern Stomper, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 dinosaur at common. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2. You can pay 3 generic and a green, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less this turn. This means business, and in addition to adding such a huge body to the board, it improves your next couple of draws significantly. The ability is costly, but there are certainly times when it matters. You don't probably want more than one of these, but as far as top curve in your green decks go, I think this would be one of the better ones you're looking for, certainly at lower rarities, giving it a C+. Next, it's Cenote Scout, which for 1 green is a 1/1 Merfolk Scout at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, it explores. This means you reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand if it's a land. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, then put the card back or put it into your graveyard. This is another 1-drop that gives me some serious Valderan Epicure vibes, and that's some good company to keep when you're talking about limited 1-drops. This will either be a 1-mana 1/1 that draws you a card, I'm sold on that, or a 1-mana 2/2 that gives you some card selection, potentially putting something in the graveyard in a format where that matters. Those options are both pretty nice, and it just feels like it'll deliver a ton of value for 1 mana, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Katti Scavenger, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 raccoon at uncommon. It's got Descend 4, and when it enters the battlefield, if there are 4 more permanent cards in your graveyard, you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This does a pretty good impression of Eternal Witness, which is always a great card. You have to set it up, of course, but when you do get a permanent back, it's going to feel amazing, and if you have to play it on curve, you don't feel too terrible about things. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Colossus Act, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/5 dinosaur at uncommon, and it's got Reach and Trample. This is a nice stat line and keyword combination for the cost. There's not a whole lot more to say about that. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cosmium Confluence, which for 4 generic and a green is a rare sorcery. Choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. Search your library for a cave card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Put 3 +1/+1 counters on a cave you control. It becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land, or destroy target enchantment. So if you can consistently search up a cave with this and put 6 +1/+1 counters on it, that mode's going to feel pretty good, especially because you have all of these other options. The downside is the cave you search up is going to enter tapped. It's kind of funny they decided to give haste to the cave that you animate because of that, but I guess if you have it untapped somehow, being able to attack with it right away can matter. But the fact that it enters tapped will often make it feel like this isn't really impacting the battlefield. But if you're in a cave deck and you can get extra value, like searching up 2 caves and making one into a 3/3, like these sorts of things are going to happen. The question is whether or not this needs a build around grade, and I think the answer is absolutely. If your deck only has 1 cave in it, there's a really good chance you drew it, and there's a decent chance it's in your graveyard too, in which case these modes become a lot less meaningful unless your opponent happens to have a bunch of enchantments. You probably don't need as many caves for this to work out as you do for some of the other cave payoffs, like probably having 2 is okay. I mean, it's still a little dangerous. You probably want at least 3 to consistently be able to basically search up a creature with this. But yeah, the destroy target enchantment mode doesn't carry enough weight for you to play this in a deck that's really light on caves. I mean, it's probably a D in your typical green deck, which might have like 2 caves in it, and it's a B in a cave heavy deck. Next up, it's Disturbed Slumber, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. Until end of turn, target land you control becomes a 4/4 dinosaur creature with reach and haste. It's still a land. It must be blocked this turn if able. This effect is basically never worth it. I get it. You can ambush your opponent's attacker with a land, or force one of your opponent's creatures to block your larger 4/4 dinosaur out of nowhere, or do 4 extra damage to your opponent out of nowhere. And I know that sounds like you're getting a lot of different things going, but those are all things that have to line up perfectly that just don't happen in Limited as often as you'd want them to. You would virtually always rather have something that adds a permanent creature to the board than something that temporarily makes something that isn't a creature into one. I'm giving this an F. Next up, it's Earthshaker Dreadmaw, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 dinosaur at uncommon. It's got trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each other dinosaur you control. You knew they had to make a Colossal Dreadmaw reference, and they did it by giving us a strictly better version. Even drawing 1 card off of this is an excellent deal, and that seems very doable, and the ceiling is a lot higher, and the fail case is that you get the original Colossal Dreadmaw. Hard to be too upset with that. This looks like a really strong uncommon to me, giving it a B. Next up, it's Explorer's Cache, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon artifact. It enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Explorer's Cache, and you can tap it and move a +1/+1 counter from the cache onto target creature. Activate only as a sorcery. So the turn you play this, you can immediately put a counter on a creature, and then the next turn you can do it again. How good is that for 2 mana? Well, not that good, especially at sorcery speed, but the fact that this keeps getting counters when things with counters die means that we'll keep on having counters for you. And there's enough of a counter theme in green, partially thanks to Explore, that this will probably be alright. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Galta Stampede Tyrant, which for 5 generic and 3 green is a 12/12 legendary elder dinosaur at mythic rare. It's got trample, and when it enters the battlefield, put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. This does not look good in Limited. Sure, a 12/12 Trampler is going to be a problem for your opponent, but paying 8 for that isn't actually that good of a deal these days, so you need the enter the battlefield trigger to do something to feel like you're getting there, and it just won't in Limited. By the time you cast Galta, you're just not going to have other creatures in your hand, and even when you do have something to play, keep in mind that you aren't gaining cards of value, you're just getting a discount, and that is substantially weaker. Sure, if you're ramping and you need a big Trampler for the late game, Galta could fit the bill, but I think it's a D. Next up, it's Glimpse the Core, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose one, search your library for a basic forest card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, return target cave card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It's been a long time since they gave us a 2-mana ramp spell like this. It can't grab any basic land, like Rampant Growth could, but it still gets you to 4 mana on turn 3, and even has some cave upside. The cave upside is kind of weird because most of the cards that care about caves check for caves in the graveyard, so getting one back from your graveyard doesn't seem that valuable to me in lots of situations. So the search up a forest mode is definitely the one that matters more, and when we think about that mode, we have to ask ourselves, These days, would it just be better to play a 2-mana 2/2? And given what formats have looked like lately, the answer is usually just going to be yeah, especially because this is pretty bad when you get it late. If there is a legit ramp deck in the format, this is likely to play a role in it, but man, am I skeptical, given that we haven't seen a legit ramp deck work out in Limited since, like, Strixhaven. There are better ways to find caves in this set, too. I'm starting this at a D. Next up, it's Glowcap Lantern, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon artifact equipment. Equipped creature has, you may look at the top card of your library anytime, and whenever this creature attacks, it explores, and you can equip it for 2. This is interesting. Lots of equipment just doesn't feel worth a card, but this one can draw you cards while also potentially growing a creature, and it's a repeatable way to explore, something that matters for explore payoffs. I'm still a little worried that this doesn't do enough to improve a creature to be amazing. Like, the best equipment is something that you can just stick on any creature and it suddenly becomes substantially better. This doesn't do that. But it is cheap and it has some engine potential. I'm going to start it at a C. Next up, it's Growing Rites of Lamok, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare legendary enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. At the beginning of your end step, if you control 4 or more creatures, transform Growing Rites of Lamok. It becomes Lamok, Cradle of the Sun. It's a legendary land that can tap for green, or it can tap for green for each creature you control. That's right, it's Gaia's Cradle. So this one's a reprint, and it was not that good last time we saw it in Limited. The initial effect is kind of underwhelming for the cost and doesn't add to the board. And while transforming it is very doable, in Limited you often just don't have anything at all to do with this much mana, especially by the time you can actually transform it. So you're mostly thinking about the front side of this card when you evaluate it. It has a little bit of upside, but not much beyond that. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Huatli, Poet of Unity, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 legendary human warrior bard at Mythic Rare. When she enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And for 3 generic and 2 red-white hybrid mana, you can exile her and then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery. She comes back as a saga called Roar of the Fifth People. Chapter 1 makes 2 3/3 green dinosaur creature tokens. Chapter 2 makes it so creatures you control can tap for red, green, or white mana. Chapter 3 searches up a dinosaur and puts it into your hand. And Chapter 4 gives all your dinosaurs double strike and trample until end of turn. I'm already pretty happy about a 3-mana 2/3 that searches up a basic land. That's probably like a B-. It's a 2-for-1, one that really fixes your mana. And then if you transform Huatli, which really is very doable, especially because she'll have searched up at least your 4th land for you. Once she transforms, things just go crazy. Adding 2 3/3 dinosaurs to the board is already an amazing effect for 5 mana. Chapter 2 isn't as exciting because you're not always going to have something to do with the mana, but then Chapter 3 searches up whatever your best dinosaur is. Then, theoretically, you cast it, since you have all of this extra mana from Chapter 2. And then Chapter 4 will buff the dinosaurs this created, plus the one that you tutored up, plus whatever other random dinosaurs you have around. So, with Huatli, you have this card with an amazing baseline that is a first pickable card anyway, if you take away its ability to transform at all, and then you add in her ability to transform, and that just completely takes over the game when it happens. Your opponent probably can't win the moment you transform her. I think overall that makes her a bomb, and a big one, giving her an A+. Next up, it's Huatli's Final Strike, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. We see this card, more or less, at common all the time in green, and it's always one of green's best commons. It's great removal that has occasional 2-for-1 upside thanks to the stats boost. Sometimes it just lets you chip in for 1 more damage, but that's not bad upside to have on a removal spell. You do always have to be a little careful in case your opponent can respond to you casting it by killing the thing you target, but the fact it's an instant means you can find a nice window more often than not. I'm giving this a B-. Next, there's Hulking Raptor, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare creature dinosaur with Ward 2. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add 2 green. A 4-mana 5/3 with Ward 2 is probably close to a C+. It's not insane just because it can be blocked and killed by a whole lot of things, but it does hit pretty hard, and the stat line isn't bad for the cost, and Ward 2 does mean your opponent, if they can't kill it in combat, is going to have to fork over some pretty legitimate mana just to kill it. So you take that card and staple onto it the fact that you can get 2 extra green mana during your pre-combat main phase, and you're talking about something that's pretty good. Obviously, that effect does have diminishing returns the longer the game goes on because suddenly you don't really need mana once you're, flooding out. But if you can play this on turn 4, and then on your next turn, this lets you play out something bigger or double spell because of the extra mana, that's going to feel good. And that certainly doesn't feel insane. I'm giving this a B-. Next, it's In the Presence of Ages, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a creature and or a land card from among them into your hand, put the rest into your graveyard. I think you'll want 1 copy of this in most green decks. It helps you load the yard while drawing you a couple of cards in most cases. It doesn't impact the board, and it isn't a permanent, and those things matter, but this enables enough graveyard stuff in the format for me to value the first copy as a C+. Next up, it's Intrepid Paleontologist, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 human druid at rare. It can tap for 1 mana of any color. You can pay 2 generic to exile a card from a graveyard, and you may cast dinosaur creature spells from among cards you own exiled with Intrepid Paleontologist. If you cast a spell this way, that creature enters the battlefield with a finality counter on it. A 2-mana 2/2 that can tap for mana of any color, already a really good card, and this has an activated ability with very relevant uses in the format. First, you can use it to hate on the graveyard, something that certainly matters in a format with prominent graveyard mechanics. Second, you can use it to exile your own dinosaurs and get them back on a later turn, or potentially on the same turn if you have the mana to cast it right away. Keep in mind it can use the mana it produces for its own ability because its ability to exile cards from graveyards is not a tap ability. So this just seems good no matter what stage of the game it is. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Ixali's Lore Keeper, which for 1 green is a 1/1 human druid at uncommon. It can tap for 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast a dinosaur spell or activate an ability of a dinosaur source. In a deck with a lot of dinos, this is a pretty good mana dork, but not all green decks in this format will have enough dinosaurs for this to be worth it. And I think that means we need to give it a build-around grade. If your deck has like 4 or fewer dinosaurs, it's probably just a D, but if your deck is really heavy into the dinosaur creature type, it's probably a C+. Next up, it's Jade Seedstones, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon artifact. When it enters the battlefield, distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures you control, and it has Craft with Creature for 5 generic and 2 green. Then it transforms into Jade Heart Attendant. When it enters the battlefield, you gain life equal to the mana value of the exiled card used to craft it, and it's a 7/7. I really like this. The initial effect isn't the worst thing ever for 4 mana, as it really does impact the board most of the time. And then later in the game, you're getting a huge artifact creature that's likely to gain you a bunch of life. It's going to be pretty hard for you to lose the game once you craft this, and the floor is a solid enough card. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Jade Lightspelunker, which for X and a green is a 1/1 Merfolk Scout at rare. When it enters the battlefield, it explores X times. Yes, please. I love Explore, and you're telling me this will let me do it for every mana I have? That's nuts. It'll come down as a large creature that nets you a few cards most of the time, and it's hard for me to want to say no to that. It can also help you load the graveyard if that's what you're interested in doing, and sometimes you're going to be in green. And even playing this on like turn 2 as a 2-mana 1/1 with Explore 1 is perfectly passable, and things really scale from there. I think that makes it a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Castlms Stone Tree, which for 2 generic and a green is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom in a random order, and it can craft with Cave for 5 generic and a green. Then it transforms into Castlms Strider, a 5/5 artifact creature, Golem. The front side of this is not very good, although the fact it can hit any land means it can help you dig for caves if you're interested in doing that, and you probably are, because the Stone Tree crafts with caves. Later, it can become a beefy creature, but overall, I'm not super impressed here. It doesn't add to the board on the front side, and crafting with caves is challenging enough that you can't really count on getting the 5/5. There are just so many better cave payoffs in this set that this isn't really the one you're desperate for. I'm starting it at a C-. Next up, it's Malamet Battleglyph, which for 1 green is an uncommon sorcery. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If the creature you control entered the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then those creatures fight each other. So this is really strong for 1 mana. 1 mana for fight is often like a C in green anyway, but this one comes with big upside. Because it's so cheap, resolving a creature and then using this to fight in the same turn will be a regular occurrence, and getting a permanent boost that makes your creature more capable of surviving and winning a fight with an opposing creature is awesome. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Malamet Brawler, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Cat Warrior at common. When it attacks, target attacking creature gains trample until end of turn. It can give itself trample, not that that's very exciting. The awkward thing about this card is that by the time you can attack with something else that is worth giving trample to, your Brawler is probably not going to brawl very well. I mean, it's a fine 2-drop, but not one I'm excited about. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Malamet Scythe, which for 2 generic and a green is a common artifact equipment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, it attaches to target creature you control. The equipped creature gets +2/+2, and it can equip for 4. You're going to want to use this as a combat trick, and when you do, it's going to feel pretty good. After all, it helps your creature win combat, which means you kill one of their creatures, and keeps +2/+2 sticking around on that creature. After that initial equip, having to pay 4 at a time to move it will feel rough, but if you've already traded 1 for 1, we're just talking about upside at that point. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Malamet Veteran, which for 4 generic and a green is a 5/4 cat warrior at common with trample, and it has descend 4. Whenever it attacks, if there are 4 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. A 5-mana 5/4 trampler is sort of passable, and the fact that this can hand out +1/+1 counters, including to itself, when you have enough permanents in your graveyard is pretty nice. I think Discover 4 is very approachable by the time the Veteran comes down, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Mineshaft Spider, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/4 spider at common with reach. When it enters the battlefield, you may mill 2 cards. This has mediocre stats, but it does help you with graveyard stuff, but there are more impactful cards out there that can fill this role. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Nurturing Bristleback, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 dinosaur at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token, and it has forest cycling for 2. I think this might be the best of this cycle. When you actually cast it, it's way more impactful than any of the others are. I mean, adding 2 bodies to the board like this is a big deal, and cycling this early gives you value for all of your Descend stuff. So I think you're going to end up playing like 2 of these and a whole lot of green decks in this format and feel pretty good whether you cycle it away or cast it later in the game. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's OHarecum, Deepest Growth, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 legendary creature god at Mythic Rare. It's got trample. When it deals combat damage to a player, reveal that many cards from the top of your library. You may put a creature card and or a land card from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. When it dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. It comes back as Temple of Cultivation, which can tap for 1 green. You can pay 2 generic a green and tap it and transform it. Activate only if you control 10 or more permanents and only as a sorcery. Well, this is great. It gives you a huge body for the cost, and it very much has the ability to get creatures and lands off the top of your deck and put them directly onto the battlefield. Attacking with a creature like this is always going to feel good, as your opponent can basically never just take 6 from it and survive, since you're going to add something else to the board every time they let you do 6 total damage. And if the card ended there, it would probably be at least an A-, because it would be a bomb that needs at least a turn to get going. But then you add in the God upside here, where it turns into a land when it dies, and we're talking about an even bigger bomb, especially because getting to 10 permanents isn't a huge ask by the late game in Limited, and he will be coming back. That makes this card pretty unbeatable, giving it an A+. Next up, it's Over the Edge, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says choose 1, destroy target artifact or enchantment, target creature you control explores, then it explores again. There are enough artifacts and enchantments in this set, and especially artifacts, and enough artifact creatures for this to work out as a destroy target creature removal spell pretty often. The double explore mode isn't bad either, though I think you're leaning a little more on the first mode than on the explore mode. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Pathfinding Axejaw, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 dinosaur at common. When it enters the battlefield, it explores. This will either be a 4-mana 4/3 that draws a card, or a 4-mana 5/4 that can help you load the graveyard and or give you some card selection. That's a really good deal for a common either way. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Poison Dart Frog, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 frog at common with reach. It can tap for 1 mana of any color. You can pay 2 generic, and it gains Death Touch until end of turn. Mana fixing and ramp, and it can trade for anything, including flyers if you have the mana. All of that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Pugnacious Hammer Skull, which for 2 generic and a green is a 6/6 dinosaur at rare. When it attacks while you don't control another dinosaur, you put a stun counter on it. So, if this were a 3-mana 6/6 with Defender, it would be okay. Not attacking stinks, but that's going to be the biggest body on the board almost always, and it certainly has an impact. Works well with cards that care about power too, and green always has those. We've already seen several. But this is way better than a 6/6 with Defender, since it can also smash in as an attacker. Getting a stun counter is downside, but being able to attack with this every other turn isn't terrible. Then there's the fact that if you have a dino around, which is pretty doable, it has no downside at all. This looks really good. I'm giving it a B. Next, there's River Herald Guide, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/1 Merfolk Scout at common. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, it explores. So this is another explore into the battlefield creature that gives you a really good rate, regardless of which explore thing happens. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Seeker of Sunlight, which for 1 green is a 1/1 Merfolk Scout at common. You can pay 2 generic and a green, and it explores. Activate only as a sorcery. I like Explore, but this looks bad. A 1-mana 1/1 just isn't a stat line that stays relevant, and while this has the ability to stay more relevant thanks to its activated ability, it's costly enough and clunky enough at sorcery speed that it's only something you're going to start doing in the extreme late game when you have nothing else to do, and this is bad at virtually every other stage. I think it's an F. Next up, it's Sentinel of the Nameless City, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/4 Merfolk Warrior Scout at rare. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get a map token. So this has a good stat line for the cost, a nice keyword for a 3/4 body, and it gives you at least some value no matter what, and sometimes all kinds of value. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's the Skull Spore Nexus, which for 6 generic and 2 green is a legendary artifact at Mythic Rare. It costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Whenever one or more non-token creatures you control dies, create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness each equal to the total power of those creatures, and you can pay 2 generic and tap it to double target creature's power until end of turn. This makes it really hard for your opponent to ever come out ahead when they try to remove your creatures or trade with them in combat, and casting this for something like 4 or 5 mana isn't that far-fetched, though we do need to take into account the times where this just gets stuck in your hand. I do think you can look at it as a card that impacts the board immediately in most situations, since the effect it has will drastically alter the game right away, often making your attacks and blocks far more problematic the minute it comes down. The double power effect will also wreak havoc on combat. Overall, I think this looks like it can take over some games, but if you don't already have something going on board, it's not going to do a whole lot. Sometimes it's going to feel like an F, sometimes it's going to feel like an A+. I think that means I'm starting it at a B. Next up, it's Spelunking, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters a battlefield, draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you put a cave onto the battlefield this way, you gain 4 life, and lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So I guess if you have this in play when you cast that Cosmia Modal spell, the haste actually matters. Anyway, you really need to be playing a cave for this to feel worth it most of the time, because you're going to need to gain life to offset the downside of playing a 3-mana card that didn't impact the board. It is kind of passable if you can't, but if you don't have at least like 3 caves, you probably shouldn't play it. It's a D in your typical deck and a C+ in a cave deck. Next, it's Staggering Size, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. This offers a big enough boost to make a creature win combat pretty often, and trample can result in some pretty serious damage to your opponent out of nowhere. I think you'll play one of these in a lot of aggressive green decks, giving it a C. Next up, it's Tendril of the Myco Tyrant, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 fungus wizard at uncommon. You can pay 5 generic and 2 green to put 7 +1/+1 counters on a non-creature land you control. It becomes a 0/0 fungus creature with haste. It's still a land. So this is fine on turn 2, and then in the late stage, it's an insane mana sink that will add a massive body to the board every turn. It's tough to beat if the game gets that late. I think that makes this a pretty high pick. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Thrashing Brontodon, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 dinosaur at uncommon. You can pay 1 and sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. This is a reprint, and like last time, it has efficient stats and upside that lets you blow up some key permanents. There are more artifacts in this set than there were in original Ixalan, so it may be even better here, giving it a C+. Next, it's Twists and Turns, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon enchantment. If a creature you control would explore, instead you scry 1, then that creature explores. When Twists and Turns enters the battlefield, target creature you control explores. And when a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you have 7 or more lands, transform Twists and Turns. Becomes Mycoid Maze, a land cave that can tap for green. You can pay 3 generic a green and tap it to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put that card into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I love Explore, so you know I love a card that makes it better. Try 1 before exploring is a relevant upgrade, and obviously this can help you find the lands you need to transform it, and once transformed, it's a great late-game mana sink. The fact that it explores when it enters the battlefield is nice too. I don't really think this needs a build-around grade, since even on its own it seems playable, provided you're a slowish green deck, and you're pretty likely to have more Explore without even trying to. I'm giving this a C+. And our last green card is Walk with the Ancestors, which for 4 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says return up to 1 target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, discover 4. 5 mana to return a permanent to your hand is like an F, but getting to cast something else while you do with discover helps soften the blow, so this is more like a C-. So that's the last green card in the set and the last card in this set review. There's lots more limited content coming about this format, including an archetype guide, a top 10 on the biggest bombs, draft videos, and lots of vlogs where I give you my thoughts on the format. If you want to make sure you stay aware of all of that, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.